Uh, we're going to move on to our keynote speaker, and that is Fred GARDAPHÉ. Most of you know him. Fred has traveled the world. He has read every word that has ever been written of creative prose on Italian-American topics by every Italian author. He's reviewed more books than anybody has ever reviewed on any topic, and he is the distinguished professor of Italian-American Studies at CUNY in New York, and he's from Chicago. He's from Melrose Park. His grandfather helped build the Italian Cultural Center, and so we're very much at home with Fred as our most outstanding representative of Italian American studies in the wide world. With so much ado, I bring you Fred GARDAPHÉ.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I want to thank you and Anna and all the people at the Casa for bringing me on. If things were different, I certainly would have come to Chicago because there's so much that I have there to connect to. I think it's never been more of an important time than now to study Italian-American culture, at least for us to study our own culture. My talk today, which I created just for this event, is called Nomi e Verbi, Verbs and Nouns in Italian-American Culture. And I open with two epigraphs. One is by Samuel Beckett in his famous quotation, which says, "Words are all we have." The second comes from Virginia Woolf. She writes, "Now we know little that is certain about words, but this we do know. Words never make anything that is useful. And words are the only things that tell the truth and nothing but the truth." I'd like to begin all of my projects by exploring the words I use and might use in creating my expression. This penchant for verbal exploration comes from a club I used to belong to when I was back at Sacred Heart School in Melrose Park. And for some reason, some of the nuns got together and they picked about 8 of us together, and they created this thing called the We Never Guess, We Look It Up Club. I haven't forgotten that. And while I can barely remember all those who were in the club, I do remember that we did get together to build our vocabularies through exercises that kept dictionaries in our hand. From those meetings and the exercises we practiced, I came to love words. And from time to time throughout my career, to study dictionaries, first word to the last, with the idea, as if Samuel Beckett once said, words are all we have, then I wanted as many as I could get. For words are the tools of writers, and the more you have, the more you can be prepared to write. From there, I continued my study of languages such as Latin, which began with the tutoring that priests gave to some of the altar boys that prepared me for my 4-year study of ancient language that was so important to the church, but was fast becoming obsolete. There were many reasons why I left the Catholic Church, but I'm sure the discarding of the use of Latin helped. I first want to talk about the word literati, which refers to an educated class, persons interested in literature or the arts. Sometimes we call this the intelligentsia. Italian culture makes a big difference between educazione e istruzione, between street smarts, or that knowledge that you gain through living, and classroom instruction, the knowledge that you gain when you go inside these buildings and study. And for a long time, Italian-American culture has privileged and promoted educazione over istruzione, because the latter was perceived as less useful in the struggle for physical survival. It took a long time for Italian-American culture to recognize the value of writers in its development, and today we are gathered to reflect on the contributions that our writers have made. My reflection comes in 2 main parts, nouns and verbs, and how they relate to our shared cultural endeavors. I'll start with the noun, which we have learned is a person, place, or thing, only I'm going to shift the order of that definition. I'm going to start with place. Had this pandemic not occurred, we would all be gathered in the Italian Cultural Center, which was known when I was young as the main building of the Sacred Heart Seminary. That seminary was built as part of the Scalabrinian Order's mission to serve Italian immigrants in Chicago. This place played an important role in my life as an Italian American and as a writer. It was built by Father Pierini, who, when my grandfather was widowed, his 4 children in an orphanage, one day found my grandfather crying in front of the statue of La Madonna del Carmine in Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church. He listened to my grandfather's story and gave him a job as a hod carrier. He had been a card-carrying member of the Hod Carriers Union. He gave him a job in the building, the place that housed the library and the first dormitory. It was on the grounds of the seminary that I could come and walk with him and my relatives around the lagoon, which is now buried there, and up the steps of Calvary Hill, which we traveled on our knees to reach the large crucifix at the top. Also there, I would play football with Father Cozy's seminarians. My grandmother, who was once a novice in the Sisters of the St. Charles of Borromeo, contributed to the well-being of that order, and her favorite, Mother Caetana, even after her death in 1969. The GARDAPHÉ name is listed on the donor's plaque in the chapel. And most importantly, the library located there was where I got my start in my lifelong studies of Italian American culture. It also was the place where my children learned to speak formal Italian. I used to try to teach them Italian. I would read them Italian children's books at night, and I found that when I was speaking to them in Italian, I have this fantastic memory of only using bad words, yelling at them and telling them to don't go in the street or eat your food, and it was kind of the way that I learned Italian, and I realized that they've got to learn more than that. So we brought them to the Italian Cultural Center, and they went there for 4 or 5 years every weekend and learned Italian. But also it's the place where, under Dominic Candelora's guidance, I began my work with the American Italian Historical Association, now known as the Italian Studies Association. Now, person. A noun could be a person, and for today I want to talk about 3 key figures who died in the past year who have each impacted Italian American culture in ways that literati should know. They will represent not only the writers you will hear today, but all the Italian American writers such as Pietro Di Donato, John Fante, Mari Tomasi, Marian Benasuti, Helen Berolini, Olga Pergallo, Rose Basile Green, Tina De Rosa, Tony Artizzoni, Tony Romano. You can go on and on. Gina Frangello, and so many more that I can talk about, but won't have the time. Dominic already introduced Joseph Tuziani, so he took away the need for me to go into great detail there, but Joseph Tuziani was the vice president of the Catholic Poetry Society of America, by the way. He was also a New York poet laureate, a scholar, and a translator. He lived a very long life, very fruitful life, and even up to his dying day, he was writing poetry. And his book, Gente Mia, was published at the Italian Cultural Center. The second person I want to talk about is Robert Viscusi, who was one of the brightest minds of Italian American culture and my mentor, colleague, and friend, co-founder of the Italian American Writers Association. He wrote a beautiful book called Buried Caesars, a book which I was able to publish in my series at SUNY Press because I had been sick and tired of photocopying the articles that he had published and handing them to my students to read. And I finally convinced him to put it all together in a book, and that came out as Buried Caesars. And his masterpiece called Ellis Island. It's really a work of genius. You can find that online. Also, in the next issue of the Voices of Italian Americana, I have a short story published, which I dedicated to Robert Viscusi. And the third person I want to talk about is somebody who's probably a lot less known, Vittoria Repetto. Vittoria was a New York poet who called herself a Guinea Butch Dyke. She transcended borders, boundaries, and really raised the consciousness, I think, of a lot of people, not only in New York, but around the United States. She's opened up our eyes to the pleasures and plights of lesbian culture and why it matters to all of us. She was taken by COVID-19 just a few months back, and it's very sad, but nobody knew that she died. She was in the morgue for at least a couple of weeks before people found out. But she was a charter member of the Italian American Writers Association, and so I wanted to bring her to your attention. There's a couple of books that are out by her, and right before she died, we were going over the next book that she was going to do, and I think at some point we'll proceed with that. Those represent the persons of the noun part of Italian American culture. Next, I'm going to move to the thing. Whether in the form of a story, a poem, an article, an essay, a blog, or a book, the writing done by Italian Americans has too often gone unnoticed by our own community. We need more exposure and support of our writers, and that means making sure the vehicles that transport the writing from individual to group need to be identified, utilized, and supported. The journals, Italian Americana, Ovunque Siamo, Italian American Review, Voices in Italian Americana, Arba Sicula, and so many more, are great vehicles for the presentation of Italian American writers. We have our newspapers, the Fra Noi, based in Chicago, La Voce in Las Vegas, Italo Americano in Los Angeles, the Italian Tribune in New Jersey, and also La Voce in New York. Publishers are some of the great things about Italian American culture. We have Bordighera Press, Ovunque Siamo, SUNY Press for academic books, Fordham University Press, Fairleigh Dickinson Press. These are all books that are looking, presses that are looking for works on Italian American culture. Other things that we need to pay attention to are our associations and their journals and magazines. No matter what your political beliefs are, NIAF, UNICO, Order Sons and Daughters of Italy, the Sons and Daughters of Italy in America, the Italian American Studies Association, the Italian American Psychological Association, and the American Association of Teachers of Italian are some of the organizations that are out there working very hard to bring the awareness of Italian American writing and culture to everybody. We don't have as many cultural institutes as I would like to see, but they're beginning to grow. Of course, there's the John D. Calandra Institute in New York, which is probably the biggest think tank, of course, located in New York, but not limited to what comes out of New York. Also in New York is the Casa Zerilli Manimo of NYU, run by Professor Stefano Albertini. We have some theater, of course, the Italian American Theater Company in Chicago, Italian American Theater of Chicago, Chaos Theater and its annual In Scena Italian Theater Festival that you may or may not be aware of. In terms of art and history, if you ever go back to the Italian Cultural Center in Stone Park, you'll see probably one of the earliest museums dedicated to Italian American art. There's the Italian American Sports Hall of Fame. There's IAMLA, the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles, the Heinz Museum in Pittsburgh, which is the site of the 2021 Italian American Studies Association Conference, has a very strong Italian American collection. And there are a few more around the country that I don't have time to get into. The educational programming, when you send your children to school or your grandchildren to school, the key, I think, is looking at where can they learn something about their Italian American culture. I could tell you that prior to studying Italian American culture on my own, I was looking for my way into the curriculum. I never found much in the curriculum that I studied when I was in school that related to me. We used to talk about the two C's, Columbus and Capone. Obviously, you know, both of those C's are no-nos now in public education. And you know, this is the key that led me into the Italian Cultural Center's library and to do this. But all these vehicles of cultural transmission need maintenance and support if they are to serve our communities into the future. Now, those are some of the nouns, and nouns are nice, but without azione or action, nouns alone can't support a complete thought. The verb to learn, to gain knowledge, is one of the most important verbs that we can use in Italian American culture. I think a lot of people who are divided by this issue of Columbus would be served very well by reading a lot more, both from many different perspectives. Also by reading the kinds of writers that you're going to see in a few minutes. I recently was asked by Oxford University Press to produce an annotated bibliography of Italian American literature, and it seems like it's an endless task. In fact, it will be an endless task, because what they're going to do is make it changeable. You know, it'll be up online. I have no idea. We were doing very well until the COVID started taking people's jobs away. So we'll have to see. But sometime in the next year, you should be able to access my annotations of pretty much the main core. And in retrospect, I realized that I've already missed a few authors, and I'll be getting them in. But the best thing about it is we can add on to it as we go on. So when you Google Italian American authors, you go to that bibliography, you can find it. Now, this brings me to the verbs that the Italian American Writers Association have sort of cemented into their mission. They have 3 rules. Rule number 1 is read one another. We can't expect other people to read the books of Italian American writers if we don't read them ourselves. I can't tell you how many times I am reading writers and think, oh, if only they had read this person, they would have gone beyond that. I think the purpose of what we do when we read is to gain knowledge. The second verb is to write. And it's rule 2 of the Italian American Writers Association, which says write or be written. Italian Americans need to write their own realities rather than waiting for others to do it for them. And this idea of writing is the idea of expressing the new knowledge that's created. Sometimes, you know, there are authors like Gay Talese, for example, who didn't read a thing about Italian American literature before he started writing his things. And as much as I love Gay, he's like an uncle to me. I criticize him for kind of jumping in and thinking that he invented Italian American literature, or it was his experience that was the Italian American experience that represents all of us. And one writer can never represent all of us. Once that new knowledge is created, we need to share it with others in order to impact change. And rule 3 of the Italian American Writers Association tells us to buy each other's books. If we want publishers to publish Italian American books, we need to be sure that we can show them a market for those books. And this kind of goes on its own. Let's buy the books, and don't just buy the used ones you can find, although I do that a lot on Amazon, books that I can hardly find in bookstores. This brings me to my conclusion, which deals with the future. And I will return to what I wrote years ago in a book entitled Leaving Little Italy, from the last chapter entitled Legacies Real and Imagined, which opened with these 2 epigraphs. The first one is from Robert Viscusi's essay, Making Italy Little. And he writes, Little Italy meant a captive market of eternal exiles who could neither enter the order of English America nor return to Italy. Little Italy was not only little by definition, but it was always getting smaller. In literary history, Little Italy has 2 favorite themes: its own nostalgia and its own death. And the second epigraph comes from Tina DeRosa's opening of Paper Fish, and she writes, our images and our memories face each other, bewildered in a mirror. Who is to solve the mystery? Now, if Robert Viscusi is right when he says that nostalgia and death are the themes of Little Italy, and if the mystery posed by Tina DeRosa at the opening of her novel has 2 players, images and memories, then what happens when those images reflect death and those memories become nostalgia? What happens when the 2 confront each other? What happens when the body and soul leave Little Italy? What happens when artists leave images of Little Italy on paper, on canvas, on film, in sound? These are the questions that I find myself asking as I move through the field of Italian American culture, looking for sites to study and sightings to report on. Ultimately, looking for that post-immigration paradigm that will form future meanings for Italian American culture. Now, until recently, Italian American culture has not depended much on books for a sense of cultural survival. As long as there were little Italies occupied by Americans of Italian descent, those histories and stories never died. As long as a good memory was nearby, the past could always speak to the present. Oral traditions were kept alive through regular and ritual interactions among families and friends. This is no longer the case. As the years go by, the old neighborhoods change, whole families move away, and with them go the stories. As long as that oral system operated, the need for reading and writing was limited. When that system started breaking down, the future of Italian America began depending more and more on how its past was preserved in images and words. Now that the great majority of Americans of Italian descent no longer live in Little Italies, it will be the job of culture and not place to help maintain and transmit a cultural identity that we can call Italian American. Poet Felix Stefanilli commented on this phenomenon in a wonderful poem entitled The Americanization of the Immigrant. And he writes, like Dante, I have pondered and pondered the speech I was born with. Lost now, mother gone, the whole neighborhood bulldozed, and no one to say it on the TV, that words are dreams. The ultimate goal of our writing is to create a self-knowledge. And this is why I think it's so important right now in the midst of observing this kind of worldwide struggle against racism. To create a self-knowledge based on a self-study that will then prepare us for an other study, an other knowledge. I never understood other people more in my life than when I began to understand the cultural forces that made me. The transmission of anyone's heritage is more and more being controlled by institutions, whether they're artistic, educational, economic, political, or religious. They have replaced the family as the means of conveying cultural values. When we have learned this and moved to ensure that such institutions are sensitive to all the cultures that combine to create American identities, then we will be able to leave the Little Italies behind as we search for new ways of being American in an increasingly globalized culture. As long as there's an Italy, as long as there are the Americas, there will be Italian Americans. And as long as there are Italian American literati, there will be new ways of seeing and of being Italian Americans. Grazie mille. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Before we go to our first author, I do have a question from the chat. This is Anna, by the way. Sorry. I believe one of our guests, Rosie, asked, was your grandmother from Trevino? And can you tell us more about her?
Oh my God. Yes, she was from Trevino. How do you know that?
That's Rosie. Rosie, how does Rosie, can we unmute Rosie?
No, well, this could go on forever.
Okay, go ahead.
No, there's so much to say. Yes, I mean, in fact, I'm writing something that I've written 22 years ago, which almost got published but never did, was a little novel called Crossing the Tracks. And it was about experiences between Italians and Blacks. And it just was not deemed useful at the time. I got one publisher to bid on it, and I had an agent who said we could do better, and we never did better. But in that, my grandmother is the hero, my grandma GARDAPHÉ. Her name was Isabella Fusaro, was her name. I could tell you more and more about that. It turns out that very many people in Melrose Park are related, and we were called Trivies. This summer, I was going to go to Trevino for the first time, but I guess I'll have to do that next summer. It seems I spent a lot more time with my family and body because we were much more connected. But thank you, Carol. There's a lot more I could say, and you and I could chat at some other time about that, especially if you have relatives from Trevino. I'd love to talk to you about.
Rosie said that it was on the net, and a professor from Trevino, Fulvio Caporale from Trevino, carries out research on Trevignesi.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you.